In today's tutorial, we're going to talk just a little bit more about subtracting integers. Now, what to do with two signs? That seems to be the big question when it comes to working with positive and negative integers. So we're going to start off with a rather simple example. 10 plus positive 3. All right, so let's have a look at what that looks as a picture visually. Here we have 10 of these circles with a plus in them. Each circle represents a positive 1. So here you can see that we've got 10 of them because we're representing 10, and if you add 10 ones, it's going to give you 10. And we want to add 3. So 1 plus 1 plus 1 is the same thing as 3. All right, so visually, we have these numbers represented. So we want to add these together. Well, we can see that we have a bunch of positive ones. We simply need to know how many we have. And we have 13. If you were to count them all up, you would see that we have 13. So what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that 10 plus positive 3, another way to say that is 10 plus 3. So these two signs become one positive. So what we can say is when you have two positive signs side by side, they become one positive sign. All right, and we keep the sign of the higher number. So if you look between 10 and 3, 10 is the bigger number. 10 is a positive number, so our answer is also going to be positive. 10 plus a negative 3. Well, what does that look like? Well, here we have 10. And negative 3 is the same thing as having negative 1 minus 1 minus 1. So negative 3 is represented here. And if you'll remember, if you have a plus 1 and you subtract 1, you end up with 0. So we're actually going to pair these pluses and minuses up and see what we end up at the end of it. So a plus 1 minus 1 gives us 0, so those two are gone. This plus 1 and a minus 1, they give us 0, so they're gone. And last but not least, this plus 1 minus 1 is also going to give us 0. So 10 plus negative 3, what do we have left? We have 7. So we can say that 10 plus negative 3 is the same thing as saying 10 minus 3. We can see that these two signs become one negative. So we can say that when we see a positive and a negative, it is equal to a negative. And again, we keep the sign of the higher number. So the 10, which is greater than the 3, has a positive sign, and so our answer is also going to be positive. Well, how about 10 minus a positive 3? Again, 10 is represented by these circles right here, and we want to subtract 3 of them. So because we're talking about subtracting a positive, then we can simply cross out those 3, take them away. What do we have left? Well, we have left 7. All right, so we can say 10 minus positive 3 is the same thing as saying 10 minus 3. All right, so these two signs become one negative sign. So what we can say is that when we have a negative and a positive, that equals a negative. And again, we keep the sign of the higher number. 10 is greater than 3, and in this instance, it's positive, so our answer will also be positive. Well, how about 10 minus negative 3? Now, this one's a little trickier to understand, which is why we get into a little bit of trouble with it. So again, here we have our 10 represented by our plus 1s, and we have to remember that plus 1 minus 1 equals 0. All right, so we want to subtract a negative 3. Well, we don't have any negatives, so we want to go ahead and add those. But if we simply just add these negative 1s, then we've changed the value of our question, and we can't do that. So we're actually going to have to add 3 positive 1s because this is equal to 0, this is equal to 0, and this is equal to 0. So we have not changed the value of our 10, but now we're able to subtract negative 3. We can simply cross off our negative 3, and what do we have left? Well, if you count those up, we have 13. So what we can say is 10 minus negative 3 is the same thing as 10 plus 3. So these two signs became one positive. So we can say that a negative and a negative is equal to a positive. And again, we keep the sign of the higher number. So 10 is bigger than 3, and it is a positive, so we are going to end up with a positive answer. Negative 10 plus positive 3. All right, so negative 10 is represented here, and we want to add positive 3, so we've got that represented here. Well, remember that a plus 1 minus 1 equals 0, so we're going to cancel off This negative and that positive, it's gone, 0. This negative and that positive is 0. And finally, we have that last negative and positive. They disappear because they are equal to 0. What do we have left? We have negative 7 left over. So negative 10 plus positive 3 is the same thing as saying negative 10 plus 3. So these two signs give us one positive. So we can say that a positive and a positive is equal to a positive. That makes sense. And we keep the sign of the higher number. So in this case, the 10 was negative, so our answer was negative. So if you can remember that, it's a really quick and easy way to check yourself to see if your answer is in fact reasonable. So the higher number, the sign that's in front, is the sign that your answer should have. All right, so negative 10 plus negative 3. All right, so we've got this negative 10 represented here, and we want to add negative 3. Well, they're all the same, so we simply need to know how many negative 1s do we have, and in this case, we have negative 13. And so we can say that negative 10 plus negative 3 is the same thing as saying negative 10 minus 3. So these two signs become one negative sign. So from that, we can say a positive and a negative equals a negative. And again, we keep the sign of the higher number. So 10 is bigger than 3. The 10 is negative, so our answer will also be negative, which it is. Negative 10 minus positive 3. All right, again, negative 10 represented right here. And now we want to subtract a positive 3, but there's no positives to subtract. But remember, a positive 1 and a negative 1 equals 0. So we can, in fact, add our 3 positives and our 3 negatives, and we've not changed the value at all. And now we can subtract positive 3. So we cancel off those 3. They disappear. What are we left with? We count up all those negatives, and we are left with negative 13. So negative 10 minus positive 3 is the same thing as saying negative 10 minus 3. So these two signs become one negative. And so from that, we can say a negative and a positive is equal to a negative. And again, we keep the sign of the higher number. So the 10 is the higher number, and the sign is negative, so our answer is going to be negative. How about negative 10 minus negative 3? All right, so here's negative 10, and we want to subtract negative 3. Well, we have negatives here, so we simply need to subtract them, 3 of them, and they disappeared, so what are we left with? Well, we're left with negative 7. So from here, we can say negative 10 minus negative 3 is the same thing as saying negative 10 plus 3. All right, so we see that these two signs become one positive sign. And from that, we can say that a negative and a negative is equal to a positive. So again, we keep the sign of the higher number. Higher number is 10, and it's a negative, so our answer will in fact be negative, which you can see that it is. All right, so just as a recap over what we've just been talking about, when two signs are side by side, they always become one single sign. So when you have a positive and a positive, it becomes a single positive. When you have a positive and a negative, it equals a negative. When you have a negative and a positive, it also becomes a negative. And finally, a negative and a negative equals a positive. Now, another way that you can look at it is if you have two signs the same, they're always going to be positive. If you have signs that are different, they're always going to be negative. So just an extra little tidbit for you. All right, so let's just look at a few more examples. We have a negative 67 plus a positive 345. Well, here we have two positive signs. They are the same, so they become one positive. And so we have a negative 67 plus 345. Let's go ahead and simplify that. We get 278. Now, it's important to note, you remember I said that the higher number, the sign that's in front, is the sign that the answer should have. Now, in this particular instance, it doesn't matter, but it will in a minute. You always want to look at the greater number and the sign in front after you have changed those two signs into one. All right, so again, I'll show you when it matters. So let's have a look here. 123 plus negative 72. We have different signs. We have a plus and a minus, so that becomes 123 minus 72, which gives us 51. All right, 58 minus positive 64. Now this is where it is very important to change from two signs to one before looking at the sign of the greater number. All right, so there are different signs, positive and a negative, so it becomes 58 minus 64. Now if we simply looked at the 64 before we changed to one sign, we might have thought that the 64 was positive, but in fact our 64 is negative. So always change your two signs to one sign first before doing anything else. All right, so 58 minus 64 gives us a negative 6. So our greater number had a negative sign, and our answer also had a negative. Negative 658 minus negative 951. This is another instance where it's super important to change the two signs into one. These two signs are the same, so they become one positive. So we have negative 658 plus 951. 951 is the bigger number, and it's positive. So our answer is going to be a positive number as well. In fact, it's a positive 293. And that is your tutorial on subtracting integers.